Hi folks, today we're going to be discussing Chapter 32, Structural Support and Movement. Your book starts out by talking about something called myostatin. So, exercise encourages muscle fibers to enlarge by making more proteins. That's why people who want bigger muscles will start lifting and doing aerobic exercises. Hormones such as testosterone and human growth hormone can also stimulate the synthesis of muscle proteins. That's why sometimes people will take different steroids or hormones to increase their muscle mass as well. And then there's this protein called myostatin. And myostatin is a regulatory protein that slows protein synthesis in muscles. And some individuals who have a mutation in the myostatin gene end up with really bulky muscles, little body fat, and remarkable strength. And here you can see a picture of a cow that has this disorder, as well as a picture of the same breed of dogs, one who has a genetic defect in their myostatin and one that does not. You can see how bulky they get. Animals move when their muscles apply force to a skeletal element, which may be an external or internal skeletal element. Most vertebrates, those are individuals that have a vertebral column or spinal cord, have an internal skeleton consisting of bone and cartilage, such as the skeletons you see to the right. The human skeleton is modified for upright posture. Some soft-body invertebrates have an internal fluid-filled hydrostatic skeleton that muscles exert force against. For example, here you see that the hydrostatic skeleton example is an earthworm. If you've ever watched an earthworm crawl, you'll see it literally pushes fluid through its body to move it along the earth. Arthropods and insects have an exoskeleton. That's going to be a hard external body part that receives the force of a muscle contraction. And here you can see a picture of a snail. The snail's shell is considered an exoskeleton, so the skeleton's on the outside. And then vertebrates, such as ourselves, have an endoskeleton, which means that the hardened parts are inside our bodies. So, hydrostatic skeleton, that would be of a soft-bodied invertebrate, a fluid-filled chamber that muscles exert force against, redistributing the fluid. And my example would be the earthworm. An exoskeleton would be any hard external parts that muscles attach to and move. For example, here we have a crawfish, a lobster. Those are all considered exoskeletons. And then endoskeletons are individuals that have an internal skeleton. Please know these terms. They will absolutely be on your exam. All vertebrates have a backbone or vertebral column. I've been saying this for the last few lectures. And this vertebral column supports the body, serves as an attachment point for muscles, and protects the spinal cord, which runs through a canal inside it. A vertebral column consists of bony segments called vertebrae, with shock absorbers made of cartilage called intervertebral discs between them. I'm sure you guys have heard about someone who has extreme back pain because there's something wrong with the discs in between their vertebrae. So vertebral column is basically a fancy term for your backbones or your spinal column. Your vertebrae are bones of the backbone or vertebral column, and then your intervertebral discs are the cartilage discs between the two vertebrae. And what they do is they are shock absorbers. So as you move and walk, those pieces of cartilage kind of cushion between each vertebra. We divide the vertebral skeleton into two parts. So the skull, vertebral column, and ribs constitute the axial skeleton, and the shoulders, the pelvic, and the limbs constitute the appendicular skeleton. So you can see here in this picture the axial skeleton. That would be of the head, the ribs, and then the appendicular skeleton is of your appendages. So that would be all of your limbs. Please know the difference between your axial and your appendicular skeletons. Vertebrate skeletons evolved over time. Scientists believe that the jaw that we have now are derived from the gill support of an ancient jawless fish, and that bones and limbs of land vertebrae are homologous or the same to bones in fin and lobe fin fish. So if you look at the fins of some fish, they have the same bones that we have in our hands. So what should you know? An animal's muscles exert force against the skeleton. In some invertebrates, those are organisms without backbones, muscles change the shape of a fluid-filled body cavity. Other invertebrae have hard external skeletons, And vertebrae have a hard internal skeleton made of cartilage and, in most groups, bones. So let's talk about bones and joints. Bones consist of living cells and a secreted extracellular matrix rich in collagen, which is a protein, calcium, and phosphorus. That's why you always hear your parents or your grandparents telling you to drink your milk for strong bones. In addition to having a role in movement, bones store minerals and protect organs. The femur, which is found in your thigh, and other bones of the arm and legs are called long bones because literally they're long bones. The ribs and sternum of most bones of the skull are flat bones. So if you look at ribs and the sternum is the bone that connects all your ribs together, those are all flat. And still other bones, such as your carpals, which is in your fingers and the wrist, are short and roughly squarish in shape. Each bone is wrapped in dense connective tissue sheath that has nerves and blood vessels running through it. A long bone, such as a femur, includes two types of bone tissue. You have compact bone and spongy bone. The compact bone is the hard part of the bone. That's the dense bone that makes up the shaft of the long bone. So if you were to give your dog a bone, the hard part would be the compact bone. However, if you were to cut that bone in half, you would find some lightweight bone with internal spaces that contains marrow, and that's called a spongy bone, and that's the inside of the bone. The shaft of the long bone also contains inside it yellow marrow and red marrow. Yellow marrow is mostly fat, and it fills the cavity in most long bones, and red marrow is the part of the bone that makes red blood cells. Interestingly, when we are embryos inside of our mother's uterus, our skeletons are made of cartilage. And then what happens is that cartilage slowly gets mineralized into bones right before birth. Even in adults, bones are continually remodeled and repaired. If you break a bone, it can heal. And bone mass increases until you're about 24. After age 24, bone mass gradually declines. That's why you always hear about grandmas and grandpas breaking a hip and why people take calcium supplements as they get older. Where bone meets skeletal joints. Any area where bones come together is called a joint. Cords of dense connective tissues or ligaments hold those bones and the bones of a joint in place. So a joint is a region where two bones meet. For example, you can see here like an elbow or a knee. And a ligament is the strap of dense connective tissue that holds the bones together at a joint. There are different types of joints. You have fibrous joints, which hold bones securely in place. Think about the cranial bones. When a baby is born, the bones of its skull are not completely grown, and as they continue to grow, where the space was between those bones will eventually become a fibrous joint. There's also cartilage joints, and they form flexible connections with the same movement. Think like your vertebral column. So those spongy discs in between those vertebrae are what are going to make a cartilaginous joint. Different kinds of fluid-filled synovial joints allow a wide range of different movements. So you have ball and socket joints, think your hip or your shoulder where you can rotate your arms. You have gliding joints, that would be your wrists and ankles, and hinge joints like your elbows and knees. And all these joints have fluid in between them. So if you ever hear someone who's got joint pain and they tell you they don't have any more fluid in their knee or their elbow, they're discussing a synovial joint. So again, here's an example of the knee. It's a hinged type, right? You can move your knee back and forth, or your leg back and forth from your knee. The ligaments hold the bones in place, and wedges of cartilage called menisci provide additional stability. So if someone's playing soccer or football and they hurt themselves, they might tore a meniscus, which would be the wedge of cartilage that provides stability for the knee, or they could have hurt one of their ligaments, which holds the knee joint together. The most common joint injury are sprains. This occurs when ligaments become overstretched or torn. For example, if you roll your ankle. And then dislocation occurs when bones of joints move out of place. If you're playing basketball and you catch the ball wrong, you may dislocate your finger which literally one part of the bone moves out of the joint socket. Other joint disorders include arthritis, which is a chronic inflammation of a joint. Usually you see that in hands and feet. Osteoarthritis, which is degenerative. That's when literally the bones are wearing away from the joint. And then you have rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease that attacks the tissues, the cartilage, and the tendons around different joints. Bone structure and function. What you need to know. Bones are mineral-rich organs that vertebrae muscles pull upon to move the body. Bones also protect and support the soft organs and store minerals. Blood cells form in some bones, and ligaments connect bones to one another at most joints. Bones move when skeletal muscles pull on them. So skeletal muscle are sometimes referred to as voluntary muscles, and you guys learned about that in the nervous system chapter as well as in the tissue chapter. Some skeletal muscles also take part in reflex actions such as a stretch flex. A sheath of dense connective tissue encloses each skeletal muscle and extends beyond to form a tendon. Tendons attach each end of a muscle to a bone or in some cases to skin. So tendons are cords of strapped, dense connective tissue that connects the skeletal muscles to the bones. Muscles and bones act like a lever system in which a rigid rod attaches to and moves about a fixed point. A muscle can pull but not push, and some skeletal muscles work as pairs that have opposing actions. For example, biceps and triceps. If you curl up your arm right now and try to flex that bicep, you're shortening your bicep and elongating your tricep. If you were to be working on your triceps, you'd be shortening your triceps and elongating your biceps. And this is just a picture showing you exactly what I just said. Some common issues with tendons. If you overuse your tendon, you can cause something called tendinitis, in which minor damages lead to pain and inflammation. And the way you treat tendinitis is to rest and take anti-inflammatory drugs. Chronic overuse of a tendon can change its structure and cause tendonitis. And treatment is rest and physical therapy. And a torn tendon can be repaired only by surgery. So if someone tears their tendon, they have to go get surgery. So skeletal muscles interact with bones and with one another. Muscles can only pull on a bone, they cannot push. Many muscles work in pairs, with the action of one reversing the action of the other, and tendons attach skeletal muscles to bones. So how do skeletal muscles contract? And this is going to get a little bit complicated, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you watch the YouTube videos that are in this part of the PowerPoint, because they do such a great job of explaining and animating these concepts. A skeletal muscle consists of bundles of muscle fibers covered by an outer sheath. Bones of a human in motion move when skeletal muscles attach to them and shorten them. The internal organization of a skeletal muscle promotes a strong directional contraction, and a muscle shortens with muscle fibers, and then the contractile units inside the fibers shorten. So many myofibrils run the length of a muscle fiber. A skeletal muscle fiber is a multinucleated skeletal muscle cell, and myofibrils are thread-like cross-band skeletal muscles components that consist of sarcomeres arranged end to end. Each myofibril has a light and dark crossbands, which are units of a small contraction called sarcomeres. The sarcomere has parallel arrays of thin and thick filaments, so sarcomere is a contractile unit of skeletal and cardiac muscles. Each filament consists of two chains, one that's a globular actin and a thin filament that consists of myosin. So actin is a protein that is the main component of filament muscle fibers, and myosin protein in thick filaments of muscle fibers. So there's something called the sliding filament model. And again, this is kind of complicated, so I highly recommend you watch the YouTube videos. Basically, what it does is describes how ATP, which you guys should have learned in 105, is the powerhouse or energy for sliding of actin filaments past myosin filaments, shortening the sarcomere. Shortening of all sarcomeres and all myofibers of muscle fibers bring about muscle contraction. The sliding filament model is how interactions among actin and myosin filaments shorten a sarcomere and bring about muscle contractions. So, in a muscle at rest, actin and myosin filaments lie next to one another but do not interact. So, instead of me reading off the slide, what I'm going to do is talk you through it. So, at rest, actin and myosin filaments lie next to one another, but they don't actually interact. Once the myosin gets ATP, which is energy, it's then going to grab on to the actin and literally pull it in a direction to move your muscle. Then once it moves, it's going to release the ATP and wait for another shot of energy. How do muscles know to do this? A signal is going to travel along the axon of a motor neuron from the spinal cord to a skeletal muscle. A signal is going to transfer from the motor neuron to muscles at the neuromuscular junction. And then acetylcholine from axon terminals, so the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, is going to diffuse into the muscle fibers and cause that myosin to grab on ATP and then move the actin. Action potentials or electricity from the nerve propagate along the plasma membrane of different parts of the cell, which releases calcium ions, and those are going to promote the interaction between myosin and actin. So a muscle fiber contains many myofibrils, each divided crosswise into sarcomeres, and the sarcomeres are going to get broken down into actin and myosin. Muscles contract when ATP-driven interactions between the myosin and the actin shorten the sarcomeres. Please watch the YouTube videos. I promise you, if you watch them, everything will make so much more sense. So muscles and health. In humans, all muscle fibers are formed before birth. So if someone tells you that you can get more muscle cells, you can't. You can build up the muscle fibers, but you can't actually get injected with more muscle cells. Exercises can't add muscle fibers, but it can increase muscle strength and endurance. And muscle function can be impaired by genetic disorders, infectious diseases, and some toxins. So aerobic exercise, that would be like running, walking, cycling, is low intensity and long duration, makes your muscles more resistant to fatigue. That's why when you start training for a marathon, you might start training 3 months out, and you start with 3 miles and work your way up. And what you're doing is you are increasing the duration so that your muscles will be more resistant to fatigue. Strength training, such as weightlifting, stimulates the formation of more actin and myosin, as well as more enzymes. And aerobic exercise increases the number of mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell, in muscles, which is also going to increase your endurance. Strength training involves 2 types of muscle contractions. There's something called isotonic and isometric. Isotonically contracting muscles is going to shorten and move some load, as when you lift a heavy object. So if you're lifting dumbbells, that would be isotonic. Isometric is when you're contracting your muscles, and the muscles tend but do not shorten, as when you try to lift an object but fail because this weight exceeded the muscle's capacity. As people age, your muscles actually shrink, so the number of muscle fibers declines. Fibers grow slowly in response to exercise, and muscle injuries take longer to heal. That's why you never want your grandma or grandpa to fall on their hips, because it's going to take them much longer to get better. Exercise can be helpful at any age. Strength training slows loss of muscle tissue, and aerobic exercise improves circulation, helps lift depression, and improves brain function. So you usually see people encouraging older folks to exercise. There are diseases that can affect your muscles. One is muscular dystrophy. This is a genetic disorder that causes muscles to break down. In muscular dystrophy, the affected genes encode a protein in muscle fiber plasma membranes. And what happens is it causes the fibers of the muscles to break down, resulting in death by respiratory failures. Another disorder would be motor neuron disorders. Muscular weakness or paralysis occurs when motor neurons cannot signal muscles to contract. For example, the poliovirus infects and kills motor neurons, causing the death and paralysis of young people. You guys have probably heard of Botox, and you've probably all gotten a tetanus shot. So, some bacteria make deadly toxins that disrupt the flow of signals from nerves and muscles. If you ever watch The Real Housewives of literally anywhere and you see these women and they're like, I am so mad, but their faces are totally paralyzed, that's due to the botulinum toxin, which prevents your motor neurons from releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine so your muscles cannot contract. If you've ever gotten a tetanus shot, the reason why you get tetanus shots is because the bacteria that makes tetanus makes a toxin in the spinal cord, and that blocks the release of neurotransmitters and inhibits the motor neurons, which will stiffen up your muscles. And what happens is, like this gentleman down here who got stabbed with a sword, you literally die because you're so clenched up and your muscles cannot relax. So things you should know from this lecture: muscle fibers in a muscle are organized into motor units that contract in response to signals from the motor neuron, and diseases or disorders can interfere with muscle function. And exercise improves muscle strength and endurance, but not the number of muscle cells that you have. Here are your key terms, which are also posted on Moodle. And then these are your student learning objectives, which are part of the study guide posted on Moodle.